Thank you again. So we're moving on slightly to some follow-up work from Misreading the African Landscape, because we've been working in this small area of Guinea, myself and Melissa, working as a team, gender balanced, with our Guinean colleagues, and we got to know this location very well, and people were initially puzzled by what two kind of anthropologists might be doing in their midst. Again, bearing the kind of history of coloniality, to be honest, on our shoulders. What were British people doing in Guinea? Normally they're diamond dealers, normally they're digging for gold. So there was a certain amount of, again, distrust to begin with, before we were able to learn languages and apprenticeship, become apprentices to that world. It was always important to be known in the particular localities and to be introduced by people from that locality to the wider villages where we did that study, and we needed to be a bit wider in our scope, even in Misreading the African Landscape, to see that what we were learning from one village was related to other villages, and that the kind of critique that we could develop and that others would articulate to us around, there hasn't been forest loss here, as it were, it's not our problem, to see if that was actually more widespread, or was it sort of something peculiar to the particular villages where we were. So we expanded the scope of that study much beyond the locations of our fieldwork and the friendship networks that we had. We needed to work across the prefecture, which we did, but snowballing, as it were, from village to village, friendship to friendship among those who we knew. So we worked in 5 or 6 other villages, but then once we'd established that this critique was broader, there was this question: well, why wasn't this known? Why hadn't in an independent government and the politics of independence and the politics subsequently not alerted people to the problematic nature of these discourses of degradation? And that became really an area of interest, not just an area of interest in the locality, but an area of interest that would necessarily, overflow from the Kisidugu region into perhaps other parts of West Africa. Because the articulation of alternatives, that people were living with landscapes that were able to be nurtured. One could generate forests in and transform forms of grassland into other kinds of vegetation. You could wake up the soil, as it were, by cultivating it and introduce water into the soil and bring it up into life, and change its way of being. These kinds of metaphors weren't sort of filtering out into the scientific world. I recall one of the farmers in Kisidu saying, we're like termites. And I just couldn't understand that until gradually I realized that the vegetation on termite mounds is very similar to the vegetation that grows around villages, that wherever you settle, you create kinds of soils, and wherever termites settle, they create kinds of soils. And that out of these soils, you can, different vegetation emerges. So settled life brings forest, brings a new kind of potential. So we began to see that this way of living with the landscape was sort of written in sets of assumptions about how things were, as much as in sort of intent. There wasn't a problem, so there wasn't as it were, a politics of talking about vegetation that would necessarily be part of dissent. And when there was a politics of talking about a vegetation, well, that was very political. And you didn't want to question people in what had been an authoritarian colonial and then post-colonial kind of set of contexts. So there were all sorts of reasons why these critiques weren't being articulated, some of which were rooted in what you might call the more ontological worlds of how we live with landscapes, and the others were more real political worlds, and it was the kind of coming together there that was interesting for us. But we did need to see whether the kind of findings that we'd found in Kisidugu had wider play, were significant elsewhere in West Africa. And this in a way comes to my kind of anthropology. I'm doing anthropology, working within localities, understanding those localities well and looking out, but one isn't necessarily doing it for the anthropology community. There are wider audiences than our restricted discipline, honestly. And what drives me is a set of ways that anthropology can address kind of wider injustices, as it were. And here in Kisidugu, we had been deceived ourselves. We'd written a research program called the Social Dynamics of Deforestation, after all. We'd become entrapped within, ensnared within these webs of power that had produced in us a truth about forest problematics that hadn't existed. So through our own understanding of our own, I'm going to call it stupidity, we got a little angry on behalf of those who we lived among. And we wanted to see if that issue was more widespread. So to do this, we didn't use classic anthropological techniques. What we did, we created a program of research that would look at Sierra Leone and Liberia, that neighbor on Guinea, and then Côte d'Ivoire, and Ghana and Togo and Benin, countries that shared similar ecological worlds, similar in some way colonial worlds, and certainly were part of sort of subject to knowledge networks across the colonial and post-colonial regimes that were producing knowledge about forests in West Africa. So what we did, we took those policy documents around that said things about forests and scrutinized them in relation to historical evidence. So, for example, in Sierra Leone, we found several contemporary reports and policy documents saying that Sierra Leone had been covered in forest and that this was the forest zone and that it had disappeared in the 20th century. So then it was quite easy to go to the early archives of 1900 and see exactly where forests were. Where was it on the maps? Where wasn't it? Sure enough, there were large parts of Sierra Leone that had were being accused. In fact, 2/3 of the country of Sierra Leone was being cast as having undergone a deforestation that had not happened. You see, so all of a sudden we're pathologizing, 2/3 of a nation and the farming practices of 2/3 of a nation. Now, what is going on? Why? How is something so clearly demonstrable as incorrect standing for truth? And then, of course, we look over beyond there into the other countries, into Liberia. Liberia, a magnificent history, very different to the history of Sierra Leone and Guinea, a country that's comes to be colonized by Americo-Liberians, African Americans who have established a colony in Monrovia and a couple of other areas in the 1820s, 1830s. People who are moving out of America, having been liberated from slavery and finding new possibilities, but as a colonial nation. A very complicated world. I mean, Liberia was envisaged by white Americans as a place to solve the problem of populations post the end of slavery, which most African Americans rejected, but some accepted to join. But anyway, of those who accepted to join, they travelled into the interior often and documented the interior. And what the interior that they documented wasn't necessarily only an interior of high forest, but it was also an interior of large populations. And gradually we realized that studying the documentation of Liberia, that some of the early foresters even had picked up that these were new forests in many places that were overgrowing depopulated zones. And one forester, an American forester in the 1950s, spoke of Liberia as a worn-out country of great antiquity, which isn't the image of Liberia in these policy documents that have the Liberian kind of primary forest almost untouched before the 20th century. So we were able to use these policy documents and the historical documents to show where there was friction. And there was indeed a lot of friction in each of the countries, which I'm not going to go into detail on this film, but on a country-by-country basis, we began to probe some of the dimensions to this production of knowledge about ecology in West Africa. So, for example, colonial foresters had come to see trees that were growing in open landscapes in their tall sort of forest form without branches, as they began to interpret these kinds of trees as trees that must have grown in forest that are now, that most of the forest is gone, but it's just left these tall trees in their forest form as lone survivors in the landscape. Do you follow me? Because in Europe, in European forests, when you see a tree in its forest form, sure enough, they only take this forest form if they've grown in forest. An oak tree that grows in the open becomes a spreading, branching forest. But that's not the same with many West African trees. So what was it was assumed from British ecology and from French ecologies that African trees would be the same and that they would tell the same story. But many of these trees that are growing out in open landscapes do self-branching, self-pruning. They become tall trees even outside of of a forest environment. So trees that were being understood as markers of the history of deforestation were nothing of the sort. Do you follow? The same going to fire. People were seeing fires as somehow only destructive, rather than being able to be manipulated to create modes of regeneration that were more productive even than prior to fire. Another example might be palm forests. In fact, is palm forest. So palm forests, oil palm forests, are noted in Togo and Ghana and parts of Sierra Leone. And they'd always been understood to be places that had been converted from high forest to oil palm by farmers to establish plantations, as it were, at different times. But looking at the practice around oil palm out of Kisidu and then looking at the literatures in these locations, you could reveal that oil palms grow in it can be made to grow in open savanna land and then suddenly create the conditions for the production of high forest. So oil palm isn't necessarily an indicator of past forest, and so on. So all the kind of ecologies of West Africa that are inscribed in policy documents are emergent out of sets of assumptions that are very untried and very untested in relation to indigenous knowledges, and indigenous accounts of these places. So all in, with Reframing Deforestation, we began to try to systematically expose the scientific ecological realities, as it were, as could emerge, and that in relation to the sets of assumptions that were being made around ecological history. So, to an extent, what you might say is that these are works of political ecology, seeing how ecology is shaped by politics, not just the ecology of landscapes, which are obviously shaped by political and economic histories that transform landscapes, but also that the knowledge about ecology is itself, highly political, and has been shaped in these locations differently, but in ways we could see as almost systemic across the region. All of which were leading to massive exaggerations of deforestation and massive pathologizing of modes of farming among extremely poor people that were, I think, reasonably thoroughly sophisticated. So yeah, in a way we were keen to build this understanding of political ecology, but both in a kind of discursive mode, kind of Foucauldian understandings, but not just that, but within the science and technology studies, alongside the emergence of this subdiscipline that's both anthropological but also coming out of geography and science studies and such. So that was really the impetus behind reframing deforestation. Is it anthropology? Well, that's an open question. Where does anthropology sort of begin and end? It emerges out of ethnographic fieldwork and encounter within two villages. But anthropology needn't end there. In a way, we'd taken our work out of that and then expanded out into the production of knowledge within policy discourse, within globalized institutions, educational institutions, international development institutions, global monitoring institutions. So and that required a sort of a different set of methods. At the time, I think Marcus had established this idea of sort of multi-sited field work, and in many ways reframing wasn't quite that, because we'd been looking at policy documents rather than ethnographies of policymakers. So we then established a third research program that was to do more ethnographies of these institutions, to see if we could understand how the local NGOs were being financed and staffed by people who were created, whose understanding were shaped by educational institutions that were shaped by past colonial science documents, and looking at the entanglements in the everyday production of knowledge in a more ethnographic way, rather than through the policy, a simple documentation. So that was a book that we called Science, Society and Power. It didn't just focus on Kisidou and Guinea. It could expand out, and indeed we conducted field work not simply in Guinea, but also for that book in Trinidad, strangely. Strange in a sense, and it will come back to a later film, but Guinea at this time, we were talking about sort of the year 2000 by the time we did Science, Society and Power. The wars of Liberian struggles, of Charles Taylor and of political instability in the southeast of Guinea meant that it was actually hard to do field work in that area in the way that we wanted to. So we thought that these questions that had emerged out of West Africa might be probed a little bit more widely. And so, we went to work in Trinidad to examine the unfolding of environmental policy in relation to the social relations there. It has to be said, a far more positive set of stories emerging out of Trinidad in a way that was showing how patterns of coloniality were very different in that Caribbean island than to the form of to West Africa. I'm not sure that I've got the time and the space to go into the detail there.